G'day everyone and welcome to another POLSIS Podcast. With me today I have Dr. Phil Orchard.
Hello.
And Professor Alex Bellamy.
Hi Brian.
And today we're going to be chatting about responsibility to protect, or as the kids are calling it these days, R2P. So before we go on, I think we really need to ask this question. What is R2P?
Well, R2P, the responsibility to protect, is an international principle agreed by every state in the world back in 2005. So in 2005, the largest ever gathering of heads of state and government, more than 150 heads of state and government, went to New York and agreed a number of things about UN reform and reforming the international system. And one of the things they agreed to was this principle of the responsibility to protect. And what R2P says is three very simple basic things. Firstly, that all states should protect all their populations from four crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. Secondly, that as members of the international community, states should help each other to fulfill their responsibility to protect by encouraging and providing support. And third, that states should take timely and decisive action to prevent and halt these crimes whenever they're committed. Firstly, through political, diplomatic, humanitarian and other peaceful means, and should that fail, and should the host state be manifestly failing to protect its own population, through all the measures available to the UN Security Council. That includes coercive measures, use of force, use of sanctions. This was reaffirmed subsequently by the UN Security Council in a number of resolutions passed unanimously, and reaffirmed by the General Assembly. And each year the General Assembly meets to discuss implementation of R2P. And R2P has also been included in more than 40 resolutions of the UN Security Council now.
Covers most of it. Yeah, I think I'd add too that beyond R2P, we're seeing really interesting shifts in how R2P interacts with other issues, like the protection of civilians agenda within peacekeeping, how we respond to forced migration flows, particularly those that are triggered by mass atrocity crimes, and also how we respond to these situations in terms of providing humanitarian assistance.
So this is really interesting because one of the intrinsic features of the international system is sovereignty. This notion of it's our state, we can do whatever the hell we like in it because you don't get to tell us what to do because, we get to run the show in here. It's our domestic realm. And sovereignty and responsibility to protect at the very last step basically says, no, sovereignty is a responsibility, not a right. So given that sovereignty is so entrenched in the international system, can R2P actually work in practice?
Yes, it can. And I think it's important to note here that basically what R2P reflects is a broader shift in how we understand sovereignty. And this is a shift that began really in the immediate post-Cold War period, as the international system had to confront a growing pattern of internal or civil wars, but also as they had to confront new patterns of displacement, and particularly the creation of internally displaced persons. So it was actually Francis Deng, then the representative Secretary General for Internally Displaced Persons, who first proposed this notion of sovereignty as responsibility. The idea that states had a responsibility towards their own populations, particularly their internally displaced populations, and that the international community had a responsibility to help them. And in situations when that responsibility wasn't upheld, then the international community had a responsibility to take other actions. That's how Deng framed this in terms of his response as Representative Secretary General towards IDP issues. But we can see a lot of those ideas picked up within the R2P, particularly within the ICIS document that originally created the concept, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, that very much framed it using this language. I think Gareth Evans has admitted he effectively plagiarized Deng's concept to apply it to R2P, but also to this idea that there is a necessity that states have a responsibility towards their own population, and that even though we have the UN Charter, even though we have these strong norms against sovereignty, there are some actions that states cannot engage in without having them questioned by the international community. And I think that's a really powerful shift.
On top of agreeing with everything that Phil just said, there's a couple of things that I kind of add in. The first is that we need to think about what we understand sovereignty to be. Now, there was one of our former PhD students, a guy called Luke Glanville, who's now a superstar down at the ANU. He wrote a thesis on the history of sovereignty and responsibility. And what he found was that in every concept of sovereignty, since the beginning of the whole idea of sovereignty, has been some notion of responsibility. That is, the sovereign has certain responsibilities that come with sovereignty. So sovereignty isn't all about rights, it's also got responsibilities too. So even if you look at the kind of uber realist sovereigntist Thomas Hobbes, you find in his theory a little bit where he says, look, if the state is actually threatening to kill the individual, well, the individual is released from the social contract with the state and can do whatever the individual needs to do in order to preserve his life. So even for Hobbes, the uber sovereigntist, there's a little thing that says states are responsible for protecting their civilians. Now, what's changed over time is the nature of those responsibilities and who they're accountable to. And as Phil pointed out, the whole idea of sovereignty's responsibility stemmed out of the crisis of internal displacement in the 1990s. And Francis Deng's conceptualization, and Francis was a diplomat. He was responsible for achieving practical results. And the problem of internal displacement is that the internally displaced remain within their state, and so at the whims of their own sovereign. And so Francis developed this idea of responsible sovereignty to start a conversation with state leaders about protecting their own population. And what Francis found was that whenever he would sit down with someone like Robert Mugabe, not known for being the best defender of human rights in the world, and would say, look, Mr. Mugabe, you are the president of Zimbabwe. With that comes responsibilities to those people who live in Zimbabwe. He found that nobody disputed that fact. Not even the worst human rights abusers in the world disputed the fact that they had responsibilities to populations in their boundaries. And so that started this kind of whole conversation. The other thing is, of course, that R2P isn't just a nice kind of academic theory or phrase or concept. It is something that has been specifically agreed by member states. It's their concept, it's their invention, so it's not something that's been imposed upon them from above. It's not something that you just see in textbooks. It's something that you see states vote for again and again and again. And as I said, 40 plus Security Council resolutions. And states pay attention to what it is they're voting for. They have very skilled lawyers, very skilled diplomats who think about the implications and the repercussions of what they're voting for. So they don't do things by chance. They scrutinize and they're very, very deliberate. And R2P is really very clear in what it expects states to do.
There have been a number of examples of R2P happening in the world, but probably the most famous, for a lack of a better word, example of R2P is Libya. And it's famous for some good reasons, but it's also famous for some really bad reasons. So what sort of lessons can R2P learn from the sort of fallout of Libya as a case study in R2P?
Okay, well, I'll take a stab. Firstly, as you say, Libya is the most famous case, but it's neither the first case nor the only case in which R2P has been used. Libya stands out because it is the first time ever that the UN Security Council has authorized the use of force against a functioning state for human protection purposes. Never before had the Council done this, and frankly, not many people expected that the Council would do this in early 2011. So the Council's response to the situation in Libya was quite a surprise, and was driven by all sorts of contextual and political factors that are unlikely to be repeated very often. In the immediate term, there is, I think, no doubt that the intervention prevented a massacre in Benghazi. That was the driving concern of the Security Council, and not one member of the Council disputed the view that there would likely be a massacre in Benghazi should intervention not occur. That is why China and Russia allowed this resolution to go through, knowing full well what was in the resolution. If we take that as our starting point and evaluate the success of the mission, the question is, would Libya be better or worse today had there been no intervention and the civil war was still going on? Because that is the likely scenario. Now, to get a kind of sense of whether Libya today would be better or worse, one can look at Syria and say, well, is Syria better or worse than Libya today? Well, clearly it's worse on every single measure. And everything we know about protracted civil wars tells us that the longer they go, the more people are going to die, the more people are going to be displaced, and the more escalation you're going to get. If you look at the actual rates, the casualty rates in Libya, they are high. Between 3,000 and 5,000 people died violent deaths in Libya last year. but that's about 15 times fewer than died in Syria than would have died had the civil war been going on. If you think IS is stronger in Libya than it would otherwise have been, well, look at how strong IS is in Iraq and Syria. So if we take not Libya before the civil war, but Libya as it was when NATO intervened, and just imagine what Libya would be like without intervention, I think there's a good case for saying that Libya is better off because of it. Now, clearly, post-intervention, the ball was dropped for a number of reasons. During the intervention, we know that the UN was planning for a post-intervention peace-building mission, a peacekeeping mission. Ian Martin was head of a transition team, a very experienced diplomat who played a key role in East Timor. But the plans were leaked, and the new transitional authorities in Libya adamantly said, we do not want a UN peacekeeping or peace-building mission. Now, this goes back to the issue of sovereignty. And the bottom line is, if a state says that it doesn't want such a mission, well, it's very hard to impose such a mission on a state. Now, of course, there were lots of people in the West to whom this was music to their ears because they didn't want a long and protracted commitment in Libya as well. As it turned out, of course, the transitional authorities were unable to hold the thing together, and there are now at least two different governments claiming authority in Libya. But negotiations are going on. In terms of what lessons should be learned, well, clearly, the planning for the peace is key. The UN had the plans, but didn't insist on the implementation. And to those who say that the UN should have insisted, this is the question: should the UN impose its will when it comes to post-conflict peace building when the host authorities don't want it, or should it not? And that's a difficult question. Clearly, more attention and more thought should have been given to the post-conflict scenario. But the other thing to bear in mind with the Libya case is it all happened really very quickly. Prior to the crisis in March 2011, Libya was on nobody's watch list. It was not considered a fragile state. It was not considered a high risk of atrocities. So people were making things up on the hoof very quickly to respond to changing threats. And as I say, there are lots of lessons to come from it. My sense is still that the evidence suggests that Libya is better off because of the intervention than it would have been without it.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. This is a very congenial discussion. I think the one thing I'd add is the other lesson that comes out of Libya is the question around regime change. And there, R2P is not connected to regime change. There you saw a deliberate connection made by NATO and the heads of state of a number of Western governments who made the arguments that Gaddafi had to go. There could have been alternative responses to Libya that would have safeguarded the population, that wouldn't have necessitated regime change. The problem there is it would have been something like a no-fly zone, or it would have been something like a safe area, where you would have troops deployed for long periods of time. And I think, unfortunately, part of the issue we had is there wasn't the stomach for that. And so, I think there were alternative steps that could have been done there that might have resulted in a better outcome. I'm not sure. It's very hard to sort of crystal ball gaze around these issues. But certainly, the default position I think that was adopted around regime change was problematic in the case of Libya and has been problematic since, not only around questions around Syria, but also other cases.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up, because Phil raises a really important point, and it's the point that goes to the changing nature of international diplomacy. There was once a time, back in the golden days of diplomacy, where states could say one thing to their own population and another thing entirely to the foreign populations and foreign governments, knowing that the two would never speak to each other. Mm-hmm. But those times are gone. And it really becomes clear when you look at the regime change messaging of Obama and Cameron and Sarkozy over Libya. Why did they feel the need to give that message? Well, because they had to give their domestic populations a clear rationale for what was happening and why it was happening and what the end state will look like. I was in Washington, D.C. when the intervention started. Congress was not happy. They were wanting to know what the end state was, when will the objectives be met, how long will this commitment go for. And with those sorts of pressures, those leaders had to come up with regime change as the rational end state. As Phil says, though, as soon as you come out and say regime change, you tarnish R2P, you link yourself to all sorts of measures that you aren't necessarily directly related to the protection of civilians, and you raise all sorts of political controversies that you don't want to raise. But you can understand why those governments and those leaders felt the need to do that, given the domestic politics. And it goes to the fact that now, in a globalized era, your messaging goes out to both domestic and foreign audiences, and trying to balance the messages is really a difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, that's been very problematic in the case of Syria as well. You can sort of see as soon as that regime change argument, the Assad must go argument started being made, John Western did a presentation earlier this year where he basically points to, you can see a clear shift, not in the Syrian government's position, but in Russia's position, where Russia was seeking to slow down or at least ameliorate the atrocities that were occurring. And then as soon as that argument starts getting made, you see sort of Russia just change their position entirely. So I think, rhetoric like that has lasting consequences.
So moving away from Libya to a case that's happening as we speak, and as this is something that is evolving and changing every hour, every day, just a warning, what we say now could be completely irrelevant a week from now when something happens. So if you're listening to this podcast at a later date, keep that in mind. But in the recent weeks, the peace process in South Sudan has pretty much broken down. Both sides have alleged to have committed crimes against their populations, breaches of human rights. So what role do you see R2P having in that conflict that's evolving at the moment?
Well, first of all, we should note the role that R2P is playing. So on the ground in South Sudan is the UN mission for South Sudan, one of the larger UN peacekeeping missions. And that's a mission authorized under Chapter 7 of the Charter, so that includes authorization to use force. We have a mandate to protect civilians from human rights abuse and to assist in the fulfillment of the responsibility to protect. So R2P is explicitly written into the UN mission on the ground in South Sudan right now. Now, there's been some practical innovations that mission has undertaken. So when that mission was first deployed, this was pre-Civil War, it was deployed with a mandate to help the state, build itself, build a new state. Once that collapsed and the country collapsed into civil war, the mandate was pared back to supporting the delivery of humanitarian supplies and protection of civilians. Now, as part of that, the UN has developed what's called the Open Gates policy, which is when civilians are fleeing threats or under threat, the UN will open the doors to its compounds and allow civilians to come into its compounds, and then the UN will protect those compounds and the people within them. Now, at times in the past 12 months, there have been more than 500,000 people housed in UN compounds because of this policy. And sometimes it's literally involved unarmed civilian UN staff locking the gates and going out to confront armed militia and say, this is the United Nations, you can't come in, with nothing other than the force of their argument to stop those militia coming in. So the UN is taking steps. Other things that it's done is provide early warning to communities. So where it's noticed movements of armed militia, UN peacekeepers have been able to provide that information to communities so that they can flee out of harm's way. So that's the protection of civilians. But of course, you can't have a UN peacekeeper behind every tree. It's a large mission by UN standards, but it's a tiny mission by sort of NATO standards, for example. You're talking about a few thousand infantry soldiers. NATO deployed 50,000 people to Kosovo, a province the size of North Brisbane. So you can't have a peacekeeper behind every tree. They can't stop every atrocities. That's where politics has to come in, and the UN has been trying to broker an agreement between the sides. The additional problem being, as you said, both sides are responsible for committing these crimes. So the policy choice is a difficult one. It's, do you keep that mission there, trying to do what it can and saving a few thousand lives, but certainly not every life, it's simply not capable of doing? Do you withdraw the mission and say, well, the conditions aren't right for peacekeeping? Do you think of some sort of enforcement mission? In which case, who are you going to go to war against when it's all the sides who are committing these atrocities? Do you go and impose the will of the international community on them all? These are the issues that the Council is facing. What it's trying to do so far is respond to the deteriorating situation by upscaling the peacekeeping mission so it can offer more protection, and by trying to influence the parties to sign peace agreements, which they sign and then they collapse. Now the question is, will that be sustainable in the long run, or will something more radical be needed?
Moving on from South Sudan for a moment. Now, one of the really interesting things that is happening in the international system at the moment is a rising power, namely China. And China has actually got some really interesting things to say around sovereignty and how it interacts with other states. So how does China view R2P? Because it is something I think I've seen its views shift on a bit recently.
Yeah, well, I think China is a very interesting case. And it's important when we think about R2P to realize that there's a great deal of support for the basic ideas behind it. The idea is that government is responsible for protecting its own its own population from mass atrocity crimes is well established, and that's basically accepted by every state. No state questions that. No state questions the idea of international cooperation to assist governments in fulfilling those responsibilities. I think where we see any sort of level of disagreement still around the norm is it comes around to these ideas around the particular aspect of whether a state is manifestly failing its obligation, which may trigger Security Council action. And I think there we see hesitancy on the part of a number of states, including both Russia and China. But I think China's position is very interesting on R2P. I think they are supporters of it generally. They do have questions around these issues, and they're looking for clarification on them. I think more than sort of challenging the norm directly.
It's often the case that we put up Russia and China as the bogeyman of blocking international action here, there and everywhere. But it's worth remembering that China has voted in favour of more UN resolutions containing R2P than has Australia, because China sits on the Security Council. It has voted in favour of more than 40 resolutions with R2P in it. The Chinese permanent representative said that the inclusion of R2P in the resolutions on Libya, for example, were uncontroversial. Libya was clearly a case for R2P. As Phil points out, what is an issue for China is this issue around the use of force and the question of host state consent. But there again, China is rather more flexible in its practice than sometimes it is in its rhetoric. So it abstained on Libya. I mean, this is a landmark resolution. China abstained on it. It could easily have cast its veto and blocked it, yet it abstained. We've also seen China support the increasingly robust measures in UN peacekeeping. So more and more missions deployed with Chapter 7 mandates, authorized to use force to protect civilians. Where China has drawn the line and cast its veto are firstly, of course, on Syria. And there China's view is very much one that we need to be more cautious when thinking about weakening the state. As Phil mentioned, the issue of state sovereignty is really crucial for China. And China sees the problem in Syria quite differently to the way the West sees the problem in Syria. It sees the problem as one of trying to manage change and avoid instability. And a lot of the way China sees these internal problems is, of course, through the lens of the Cultural Revolution and the shock that China had with the Cultural Revolution and the priority it then gives to stability. But even on Syria, the sense is that China isn't the main problem on Syria, that were Russia to move its position, China would not block any of the resolutions or action on Syria. And it's important to note as well that even on Syria, the Council has been able to find consensus on a few things, like, for example, the delivery of humanitarian aid without the consent of the government. So even here, you see China voting in favour of resolutions that are eking away a little bit at state sovereignty. Other times where China has used its veto, which were in kind of non-R2P situations, which were to do with Myanmar and Zimbabwe, in both of those cases, China made the interesting argument that its position was in line with that of the relevant regional organisations, so ASEAN on Myanmar and the African Union on Zimbabwe. And China places a great deal of stall by the views of relevant regional organisations and attitudes in the UN General Assembly. So generally, if you can get the relevant regional organisation on board, China is much less obstructive and has been much less obstructive than some of the kind of rhetoric in the West would tend to believe. And the other thing that's finally worth emphasising about China is that China over the last 2 decades has massively upscaled its engagement with the United Nations. Of the permanent 5 members to the Security Council, China is now the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping. It's made pledges to extend that cooperation. So China is now sending its own soldiers to do Chapter 7 peacekeeping missions with protection of civilians mandates in greater numbers than our other members of the Security Council. So it has its reservations, and I think it's right that it has these reservations. Questions of whether you use force or impose sanctions on a state shouldn't be taken lightly. They should be debated. They should be disputed amongst member states. It has these reservations. It has this different way of thinking about the world to the West. It prioritizes stability. And, look, after the rise of the Islamic State in Syria, who's to say that China and Russia were wrong about the risks of weakening the Assad regime without a plan for what comes after it? But nevertheless, China has played largely a part of being a constructive partner on R2P.
So going forward, what future role do you think R2P will have in the international system?
Well, I think it's important to think back that when we think about R2P, we're thinking about a concept that has only really been supported by states for a little more than a decade. And I think over that period of time, we've seen a significant deepening of that level of support. R2P is really unquestioned now by states. It's questioned around the margins, it's questioned around how it gets implemented. So I think that's really where the future agenda lies. I think we've seen that in initiatives like Brazil's responsibility while protecting idea, even though they sort of dropped it. It's the idea of clarifying particularly how the Security Council should respond to R2P situations once it makes that initial decision. I think certainly one of the reservations the Council or Council members had following Libya was the idea that the Security Council had approved the intervention and then was sort of outside of the loop once NATO took it over. And so I think deepening Security Council practices around this, bringing in a mechanism like already exists around sanctions, will probably be something that we see evolve, where the Security Council will have more monitoring once an R2P decision's been made. But I think it's important to note that there are always going to be hard cases. There are always going to be series out there. But by and large, the Security Council, the UN, and member states are dealing progressively with R2P situations. It's getting dealt with frequently. There's problems, of course. We don't know how to respond to a lot of these situations adequately. But we're having these discussions in a way that didn't happen before.
Absolutely. I would agree again with Phil. I mean, two things that are worth bearing in mind in terms of the kind of long-term trajectory, as Phil points out. The first one is that the international community is now much more likely to respond to cases of mass atrocities than it was prior to R2P. Much more likely. You think of Cambodia and Pol Pot, Idi Amin in Uganda. These didn't even get on the Security Council agenda. Now almost every case involving mass atrocity crimes gets onto the Security Council agenda, and their presence on the agenda isn't contested. Now that doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree about what the best course of action is, but it does mean they all do agree that the international community ought to do something about it. And that wasn't always the case. The second thing is, when the international community does respond, protection and the protection of civilians from these crimes is at the core of that response. Now that might seem like kind of common sense, and well, of course it would be, but again, that wasn't always the case. In the 1990s, the United Nations sent a very large peacekeeping mission to Bosnia called the United Nations Protection Force. Yet the United Nations Protection Force did not have a mandate to protect civilians in Bosnia.
No, they didn't.
Absolutely. But now, protection of civilians is at the core of the international community's response. Now, as Phil said, when we're looking at situations like Syria, we have to expect a relatively low success rate. The reason for that is that the reason why these conflicts come to the fore and erupt and escalate is because they're difficult to resolve. If they were easy to resolve, if there was a set of easy answers out there, somebody would have found them before it gets to this stage. The reason we don't talk, for example, about genocide in Guinea is because back in 2009, when genocide was threatened, concerted international action was brought to the fore and brought the parties back from the brink. Now, who talks about Guinea? Well, nobody, because nothing happened. Situations like Syria are wicked problems in every sense. We are talking multiple parties, geopolitical ramifications. And the interesting thing is none of the resolutions that were vetoed actually contained within them a viable pathway to peace. Ultimately, only if the parties themselves want to achieve peace and stop these atrocity crimes will that happen. We shouldn't overestimate as we often tend to do, the capacity of the international community to influence that, besides massive, expensive and very dangerous intervention that is always going to be and always has been the rarest of responses. So in a sense, the measure for R2P success in the long term, I always think, is not whether we finesse the art of decision making on the Syrias of this world. The Syrias of this world are always going to be messy, complicated, success rates are going to be low, and we're going to try and learn lessons, but hey, these cases are so idiosyncratic that what we learn from Syria may not necessarily apply to South Sudan or Yemen. But it's, are we reducing the number of cases that get to that stage? And I think if you compare this decade with the 1990s, let's say, well, yes, we are. We are employing peacekeeping operations more quickly, stemming it in the bud. We haven't had another Rwanda. We haven't had another Srebrenica for all the situations that could have given rise to another Rwanda and a Srebrenica. And that's a low benchmark for success, but nevertheless, it is progress. And these are fights that every generation is going to have to wage, and people are going to have to be committed to this norm, stand up for it, and make the arguments for it in each and every case, because if you don't, slippage can happen very, very quickly.
So with that, I must call this podcast to a close. I would like to thank Phil and Alex for joining me today, and for you for listening in, and we'll see you next time for another POLSIS podcast.
She's quite rightly, because of her political experience, she's seen as a bit of a policy wonk. And then that came out in Clinton's own speech. She said, I'm the person that you want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with that phone call with an emergency overseas.